Okay, so it is my pleasure now to present and to welcome Martina Panisi. She's going to be our first invited junior keynote speaker. And so Martina is doing a PhD in biodiversity, genetics and evolution in school. Her main interests are in ecology and conservation of island species, but Martina is also enrolled in some social issues, and she has been recently participating in the TED Talk, so congratulations, Martina. And with no further delay, I suggest that we now fly to the beautiful islands of Saint Tomé and Príncipe and to hear Martina's work. Martina, you have the floor. The floor is yours, and you can share your presentation, please. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. Do you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you so much. I really hope that the annual meeting will go well today and in the next few days. And I'm actually honored of presenting among so many students and researchers belonging to theatership. And so, as Gabriela was saying, the main aim of this session was to bring you around the world, and that is why I want to bring you on the equator line, and in two islands that most of you know, Saint Tomé and Príncipe. So these islands are part of the Guinean forest of Guinean West African forest, a biodiversity hotspot. And this is because they hold a high number of species that only exist there, and at the same time, they are most threatened. So I don't know if you have already been there or in this forest, but it will be very easy to see a lot of species, especially of birds, amphibians, reptiles, and plants and terrestrial mollusks that only exist in these islands. But this biodiversity has changed a long time. These islands were found the first time in the 15th centuries. And of course, people, when found these islands, they didn't realize at first of the treasure in species that existed in these islands. So they started to deeply modify it. If at first they were almost totally covered by native forests, right now around 1/3 in both islands are covered still with the original native forest. And the rest has been progressively degraded, mostly for the production of sugarcane, cacao, and coffee. And this, of course, had some consequences on biodiversity. And I think that when we travel around the world as conservationists, we also have to more and more speak about our responsibility in traveling, especially if we want to have a positive impact on the environment, we should travel consciously. But if it wasn't for some of the researchers in that work also in CSTC, like one of my, two of my supervisors, like for example, Ricardo Lima and other NGOs that started to work in these islands, we wouldn't know anything about the unique biodiversity, the distribution and the threats that these species are suffering. So their work was really essential, especially in these last decades, because before there was almost nothing about that. But if there were many progress in many of these groups, such as birds and amphibians, reptiles, for much time, the terrestrial mollusk group remained mostly understudied. There was something about taxonomy, but almost nothing about conservation and ecology. And that brings me why I'm here. Well, when I was adopted by Lisbon University some years ago, I had an aim that maybe, a mission that maybe is silly, but I wanted to find an invertebrate to study and protect. And this is why, because I think that it's very challenging to try to change people's perception on biodiversity loss, and especially what is most commonly like an anthropocentric point of view, by using those species that sometimes are not a lot noticed, or we don't, they are very different from us, and make people understand how, on the contrary, they have a high importance to us, an ecological point of view, and sometimes also a cultural point of view. So also I've been pretty much fascinated more about this group than other groups, and I find it unfair that sometimes these invertebrates are underrepresented in conservation, and that maybe some of you can relate that study invertebrates, or also who like to study plants, and that sometimes we even risk to lose species, that species disappear without even noticing that they exist. And of course, if nobody start to get an interest in them, nobody will care or start to do something to avoid this disappearance. So the land snails and slugs are one of the group, if not the group, with the highest number of recorded extinctions due to human activities. One of the most famous cases is the case of Hawaii and French Polynesia, where a predatory species of snail, the rosy wolf snail, was introduced to for biological control of another species of giant snail that was rapidly spreading. And instead of targeting the giant snail, started to target dozens and dozens of native species, contributing to their disappearance and sometimes extinction. So the main threats in Hawaii are kind of similar in San Tome and Principe in the context of forest degradation, and also some species of land snails and slugs were introduced. But we don't have predatory snails yet, luckily. So one of the first, so when I started the PhD thesis with my supervisors, the main aim was to start working on ecology and conservation of this group, and especially to focusing on the relationship among land snails and slugs, the forest and people. But as I told you, we didn't much know about them. Even the taxonomy wasn't really solved until now. So thanks to some taxonomists such as David and Geraldine Holiak, and we also have in the sampling, we finally found that in these islands exist about 86 species of land snails and slugs, and 55 only exist in San Tome and Principe. So one of the first questions that came to our mind is, how is this group reacting to forest degradation? So how do land mollusk assemblages vary across land use types in San Tome Island? I think that if you have already heard a presentation about San Tome, you know that this island, you can see the map here on the right, has a very clear gradient of forest degradation. You can see in the center, in the mountains, you can find native forest, which is much more preserved. And then around, we have secondary forest that is the result mostly of a plantation that were abandoned. And then we have shade plantation that are still active. And finally, in yellow, you can see non-forested areas, which are also composed, for example, by urban settings. Yeah. So how forest degradation is affecting species richness and abundance? To do so, together with Leonora Tavares in the context of her master thesis, we performed a survey, and we sampled 132 sampling points stratified according to land use types across the gradient of forest degradation. And in each of these points, we try to record species richness and abundance of native and introduced species, and also to record a set of environmental variables to try to understand through generalized linear mixed models with which of these variables are most affecting terrestrial mollusks, and then separately native species and introduced species, and try to compare them. So what we find is that the most important variables are, for example, if we see native species here in green, they prefer to occur in areas with higher precipitation, presence of more dead wood, and areas with more litter, and lower soil temperature. But there are also two variables that I want to show you more in detail. So in total, we found, I didn't say that in total, we found 33 species out of 59 occurring in San Tome. Regarding land use, we understood that with the intensification of land use degradation, there is also higher species richness and abundance of introduced species. While native species are, for example, species richness of native species are mostly associated to secondary forest, or in general to well-preserved land use such as native forest and secondary forest. If you look at the graph here, you have the same ordination. On the left, you can find the sampling points that are colored according to the land use types. And on the right, you can find the species. In gray, native land snails and slugs, and in black, you can find introduced. You see that native species on the left part of both graphs are more associated to well-preserved areas, while is the contrary for introduced species that are associated more to non-forested areas. And another interesting thing is that, well, this pattern is noticed also for other groups. And maybe you are familiar with this pattern. And it's also similar to what happened with birds in Saint Thomas. And regarding another important variable was the vegetation composition. So for each of these points, we recorded the present and absence of plants that's in those plots of 10 per 10 meters. Each point was 10 per 10 meters, and we recorded the plant species there. So if we try to see if there are association between native and introduced land snails and native and introduced plant species, we can see here that where we have higher species richness in introduced species, it's also associated to more to presence of introduced plants. So introduced land snails are associated to some introduced plants, such as coral tree, banana tree, or taro. And this make our reflect about introduced species are still limited to more degraded areas, but maybe with the spread of these introduced plants, they can find a pathway to enter inside the well-preserved areas. So this can be a problem. But we were speaking about introduced species, and I want to, which are these species? Well, this is certainly the most famous one in the island because it's widely spread and it's very abundant, is the West African giant land snail. And we think that it was introduced in the islands around the 70s, and probably it came from West Africa, probably because we are still trying to understand this with genetic analysis, even if it's difficult to assess. And once it was introduced, for example, in Saint Thomas Island, in the center, in the north, sorry, people started to spread it, so they contributed to the spreading of this species because it's used as a food source. And right now you can see that this is its potential occurrence and distribution in the probability of occurrence in the island. And you can see that it's much widely spread all over the island, and it's also entering inside the Obo Natural Park. This was part of our first research on this species. So if this is so important as a food source, we started to ask ourselves, what is effectively is the socioeconomic importance of these invasive species? And so we did surveys together with another master thesis and also focus group with communities, and we to assess the commodity chain of these species and the main groups that were involved in the trade and harvesting of, in general, of these species. And we found that, well, this is the second most consumed source of protein, and especially children and women are the groups that are most involved in the trade of these species, especially from less wealth condition. So this might be a very important species, even if it's invasive for people. And this makes us reflect how much is important to assess it, to take in consideration the human component when trying to do something at the level of conservation. Of course, we cannot eradicate, even if it will be anyway impossible to do that, a species that is so important for people. And that brings me to another giant snail that probably most of you already know. So this is a species of snail that only exists in Saint Thomas and Principe, and the invasive one was related during my master's thesis to the decline of this species that is threatened. So at first, during the master, we started with understanding the distribution and the main threats on this species. And then lately, also during the PhD, we understood that effectively is declining much on both islands, and its occurrence is mostly in forested areas of native secondary forest and remote areas. And we started also to try to understand what its genetic diversity, and seeing that, for example, is haplotypic diversity, at least at the cytochrome oxidase 1, using this mitochondrial gene, is much more diverse in Principe Island, and this can be useful for conservation purposes and to have more targeted conservation actions. But why am I speaking a lot about this species? Well, this species is important because it's it's a link with people. It has a cultural importance. So when we started to engage people in the research about terrestrial mollusks and in general, specifically about giant snail, we understood that people knew this species, and there were very different perception about this species across generations. So elders recognized this species because it was abundant in both islands, and it was easy to find when they were children, for example, around home. But children do not even know about this species because it started to decline too fast for them to know it. So we started to, about children, we started to think, so well, this is normal because imagine if the new generation do not have experience or knowledge or memory of how the condition of their environment, the past condition were, they cannot understand how much this has changed. And we started to think, so what is the baseline knowledge of children right now? And that came the question, what do children know about endemic and non-endemic wildlife in São Tomé and Príncipe? And especially to assess factors that are related to the ability of children to recognize endemic and non-endemic animals and relate recognition with preferences. So to do that, we surveyed rural and urban schools in São Tomé, and we asked children to participate to a card game where we had a balanced set of pre-selected animal species, and they were asked to recognize them and then to select the one that they preferred mostly to protect and to justify their choices. And then we used generalized linear mixed models to investigate links between the ability to recognize wildlife and factors that are related to the students, for example, their age, gender, economic status, natural exposure, the school, or the species used. And finally, we related knowledge with preferences to see if there was a link, a correlation amongst them. And what we see is that children in São Tomé, children that are poorer, male, or from rural school, are better in recognizing species, and especially rural children recognize better endemic species than urban children. And here we see again our invasive species, which was the second most recognized species, and that is simple. 75% of the students harvest this species, and so they are very familiar to it. And when we see the relationship between species recognition score here on the x-axis and the conservation preferences, we didn't find any correlation between them. But some species, such as the invasive snail, it's well recognized and is also chosen to protect. So when we ask why, children choose species to protect because of their attractiveness or profitability, is what we found. And especially for these species, they want to protect it because it's useful for eating it or selling it. So of course we have to evaluate these all these factors when we want to do conservation or environmental education, because well, it's the baseline before building targeted environmental education programs and activities. So this was just a kind of an overview of some of the things that have been done in ecology and conservation in the context of the thesis and this PhD thesis together with master thesis and etc. But during all of these, community engagement was also very strong because people are very important in conservation. And one of their advice, for example, that validated what we wanted to do was the construction of a small ex situ site to start studying the ecology and reproduction of these threatened snails I was speaking with you about, the oboe giant snails, and also use it as a place that people can visit, and schools, for example, to learn more about the forest and the decline of these species. And so after building that, we took the advantage to do another research, which is try to evaluate if a visit to this site can contribute to improve children's knowledge about biodiversity by using drawings before and after the visits. and this is still in the analysis part, data analysis part. So, so since we didn't know a lot before, and now some efforts started to happen in conservation, not only with children but also with guides and with the government. You can see also maybe Professor Paulo Borges recognized the single species action plan done with the specialist group of IUCN. But of course, there are many challenges. Well, now we can see the challenges mostly related to the species, because a lot of conservation efforts have been put in the species that has this cultural importance. For example, the occurrence of what we think is a disease, and we still don't know what is it actually. But I think that it was, I'm happy with what has been done, because I think that it was really important to avoid that the only memory of this species, for example, would get extinct with the eldest generation. Well, now it didn't get extinct at least, and some relevance and some attention to this group, the terrestrial mollusks, started to be put not only at the national level, but also outside the San Tomé. And this is good for, because it started to get a relevance, even if it was a group that wasn't really much noticed before. So thank you so much for listening, and I want to thank you so much my supervisors and the tropical Mediterranean groups that are here and they are always very supportive, and all the entities that made this research and project possible, that collaborated for that, and Vasco that also collaborated a lot and made these beautiful photos that at least I like a lot. And thank you for organizing this meeting and for listening.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. Gabriela, you have no sound.
Sorry, I thought I was speaking to you. Yeah, yes. So thank you very much, Martina. Thank you very much for wonderful presentation, and also this nice part of the interaction. Also, the social interaction is also very important, and it's a dimension that you also took, and it's very important. So we have. Thank you also for keeping on time. So we have time. I prefer that we can make direct questions now before we proceed to the next invited speaker, because we have 5 minutes time if you want to comment or ask something.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, we have some. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello. I'm sorry, I'm not keeping my camera up because I really hate this angle of myself. You can see this part, and that's why I don't really put it on. Okay. Thank you, Martina, for your presentation. I have two very unrelated questions. My first question is whether you know whether your species are outcrossing or hermaphroditic, or a mix of both. Of how does that distribute across the snails? And the second question is a bit, if you could give us some more details about what type of things did you do to the kids? I mean, because you didn't really specify that, and I was interested to know how you evaluate their knowledge, and also how you make them more sensitive to these issues. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Professor Magalhães. So the first question, these snails, most of them, well, they are hermaphroditic, but they cannot auto-fecundate, only in very specific case. So it's rare that they do that. So, but yeah. And the second one, so what we did is to prepare, basically we use the story of the decline of these species that had already a cultural importance to explain about the importance of protecting the forest and other species, because it was easier to, and also because I wanted to use an invertebrate. And regarding the research, there was two parts. The first was to evaluate knowledge and preferences. And this was done with these cards of animal cards. So before the environmental education program, so there was an environmental education class. And before that, we were individually with each student performing these surveys in which they had to recognize the species. And then they have to select one species that they wanted to protect, meet, and avoid, even if then we used just the protect component. And that made us have such a broad view on what is their baseline on knowledge, at least the recognition part of the species, and on their preferences. And then the second part was so children, we brought children together also with other entities to the botanical garden and where there are the snails in ex situ. And they had to perform 3 activities, an activity where they learned about the forest and the plants. Then they had a treasure hunt related to native species. And then they had to produce a collaborative poster about native forest. And then they had to meet the snail and learn about it by seeing it, so visually. And before that, they were producing drawings. And after the activity, they were producing again drawings on the same topic. And I haven't analyzed this data yet, but what I meant to do is to quantitatively count. For example, if you have in the first drawing, you can count the diversity of items that they draw, how many native species there are, how many introduced species there are, because then we were asked like, what is this, what is this, what is this, what is this? And the same after. So this is the first part that you can do. And then you can also count the details and the colors. And then from that, you can understand what's the variation before and after the drawings, and if effectively they have learned something during this experience.
Yes, Andre. Andre?
Hi, Martina.
Hi.
Congratulations for the work first. And I know that implementing a work in tropical forests is not easy. So you started from scratch, I think, so in this project. So congratulations for that. And it's nice to see the results. And I have 2 questions. One is if you thought about how to coordinate this conservation plan of these species with other species, even with other taxa, because it might be difficult to implement a different conservation plan for each species that need conservation action. And the other question is, when you are planning to look at the effect of your field trip on the awareness of kids about these species, how do you plan to see, or if you plan to see if that awareness will stay over time? Because you might visit and you might really increase their awareness, but then new generations come, and this knowledge, this awareness can fade away. So if you could answer that.
Thank you, Andrea. I will try to reply. So in the first thing, the first question is, so for example, for the giant snails, it's easier to coordinate the work in conservation, for example, with organizations such as BirdLife or Fundação Príncipe in Príncipe, because they are already monitoring the forest for birds or for plants or other taxa. And so they already added this component, and it's more sustainable to do it when you are doing it also for other taxa. But for the other species, and what I really would like later is to start to study more also the other species that exist there, and they haven't been assessed by IUCN. So it will be difficult because it's another type of sampling. You cannot just simply do transect and see the snails. You have to do really a survey, more intensive survey, sampling points. So it should be something different, and it cannot be incorporated in another conservation action without having much more effort. And so this then has more funding and blah, blah, blah. So we have still to focus on this component and start to work more, focus on the other species. And regarding the second question, it's very important actually, because it's not something that is easy to do. As you can imagine, the children where we did this environmental education action, then they change school, and then we cannot really following them until during time, especially because of funding. But it will be very. That's why we have to be cautious when we write papers or everything, because this is not the definitive knowledge they have. There must be something like across time that see, okay, this is something that they learned, and then it's maintained and in tests. And that's why it's always difficult to knowledge, attitude, and then really behavior. Sometimes is difficult, the relationship between these three components, and it's not always straightforward. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Thank you. I guess there are no more questions.